Fantastic. Thank you, BJ, and wonderful to be here this morning and follow so many wonderful speakers yesterday and the speakers that we'll have after me. BJ wanted me to, kind of frame this whole digital transformation thing. And, I do a lot of speaking, and one of the things about this topic of digital transformation is so many times you present to audiences that they're already part of the congregation. They're already the converted. And one of the things that was interesting about coming to this conference is I feel like this is not an audience of the converted. It's one that we could actually be provocative and talk a little bit about what this digital transformation thing means to healthcare going forward. The other thing about my presentation as I was trying to put it together, I got to tell a little story here, which is, recently we got a family dog, right? So, bringing a family dog, and we're like, well, what are we going to name the dog? All right, and so my wife is, with all the presentations that I do, she's always like coming in, it's like, are you still working on that presentation? Come on out here, come on, we need to go out to dinner, blah, blah, blah. And so she's like, well, what do you want to name the dog? Bullet Point? And I was like, oh, you were making fun of me, sorry, I thought you were serious. I was like, that'd be really cool, what's the name of your dog? Bullet Point? We call him Bullet. So there are no bullet points here, right? There are a couple of texts, but you're going to see a lot of pictures around this just to have a little bit of fun this morning. So what is this whole digital transformation thing? One, there's a lot of hype around the term. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. A lot of people come to the podium and tell what it is. Let me try to frame it as I try to frame it in the conversations that I have, because I have this, as Vijay said, a background of, I've been a technology executive as a CIO, pushing this stuff. And then I've been the business executive responsible for delivering revenue, profit, and being on the receiving end of some of these pitches, and sometimes thinking it's important and sometimes not. But let me frame digital transformation this way for the purpose of today's discussion. Digital transformation is understanding how your market is changing, how your competition is maneuvering, and how your customers' wants and needs are evolving. That translates into how you, as a leader in your organization, must navigate between today's reality and tomorrow's continuum of opportunity and risk. And try to keep that framing, because really at the end of the day, what digital transformation is about is, yes, it's the application of new technologies, it's how we leverage data as the newest asset and currency we have, but it really ultimately comes down to how we implement it. And so, there are a lot of slides I'm just going to pass through here because I didn't think it would be interesting to talk about all the things that are challenging us as healthcare organizations. This group knows that. I'm not going to talk about the epidemic of healthcare and the crisis in our nation around the explosion of chronic disease. You all know that. I am going to put up the slide about the oncoming train and that we have to pay attention to it because that's always fun. But I am going to talk about that the broad trends are really about is that technologies are now available to us in ways that they've never been before. They're fueled by this thing we just call data. And I'm kind of with Vijay, I don't necessarily think of data as a new oil. I think of data as fundamentally something different. That's why I kind of use the term data is a currency, because also its value flows up and down based on how it's being used and what you've done to it and who wants it and when they want it. But in digital transformation, it comes back to, and this is when my business executive hat kicks back in, that at the end of the day, these technologies are only useful if we're able to implement them in ways that create competitive differentiation for us and business success for us, which bring us back to the fundamentals of how do we deal within the structure of our organizations that are hard to deal with and hard to change, and the culture in which we have. If we can't bring technology and data through our structures and our culture, they don't make a difference for us. So that ultimately comes back to the application of how we use all this. And so one of the big questions that always seems to be out there, whether we state it directly or not, is who's going to create this disruptive force in healthcare, right? Because healthcare is hard, quote unquote. So is tech going to figure out healthcare, or is healthcare going to figure out tech? Which one is going to happen first? You have the people who come to the stage and saying, we got to be really concerned about what the Amazons of the world, the Amazons, the Googles, they're going to disrupt us. It's the Ubers who's going to somehow get into the value chain. And then there's all of us day-to-day who say, healthcare is really, really hard as a business. It hasn't been disrupted, and it's going to be more us implementing these things. And so what I'm really going to describe as, it really doesn't matter. We're going to see elements of both. but that, and I went through this when I was with Philips, as Vijay said, because I was part of the healthcare unit. If you know anything about Philips and kind of the longer business spectrum, they've been in a lot of different businesses over the course of their 100+ years. When I was there, they were in the semiconductor business, and they got out of that business. I watched the healthcare business grow dramatically. I watched the lighting business get disrupted by digital, basically digital technology and lighting. And I watched the consumer electronics business get disrupted by foreign competitors being much more nimble than them. So I watched disruption in my fellow business colleagues, and it really taught me a lot about healthcare. And here's what I'm going to try to convey over the course of this, which is, one, this is going to happen whether we like it or not in our industry. I'll show you some trends that basically say the confluence of forces are moving, that this is happening faster than maybe a lot of us want to admit. And in the end, and I love this phrase, fortune favors the bold. And so if you're not, and bold does, the saying isn't fortune favors the crazy, right? Bold means looking around and understanding how your environment is changing, and being willing to take calculated risks to be an early adopter for the advantage that the new way of working is going to provide. And that's why I think fortune favors the bold here, and we need, as organizational leaders, to think about where are we going to be bold, and are we going to lead, or are we going to follow? I had the fortune in my career to be inside that internet bubble that happened 20 years ago. Anyone remember that? Okay. Amazon, they can do it for books, but not for anything else. You remember that? I remember that. I remember walking into the executive's office, and basically the conversation was, we don't want to get Amazoned. So tell us how we can ignore this, right? Tell us how we can do what we're doing today and work harder. Because that's what they wanted to hear, from us consultants at that time. They didn't want to talk about what they should have been, which is, how do we understand what these little companies are doing, these little internet companies are doing, and how do we start to build our own set of pilots so we are ready for this new world? And so what you have 20 years later is a lot of companies who were very relevant in the year 2000 who have zero relevancy today and are headlines only because they're shuttering their stores, or they're trying to figure out what their business model is for the future. And so I throw this slide up here. There was a great talk yesterday by Economist talking about really how the fundamentals in our economy are changing and how we're trying to wrap our heads around the new norms. But just look at the most valuable companies in our world today. And all of them, if you look at them, have a significant strategy that they've communicated about how they're going to play in healthcare. One, because it's a $3.2 or $3.6 trillion market here in the US, but maybe more importantly is because they look at the waste, they look at the margins and say, we're going to go get a piece of that by disrupting it. Certainly the investment community, and there's more capital flowing out there for interesting new ideas than have ever been available in the world. They are placing huge bets on digital coming into healthcare and creating new value propositions, disrupting existing flows. And we need to pay attention to this. Some of the savvy organizations, provider organizations and payer organizations that I work with and talk to have their own type of investment funds that they're backing some of these companies because they want to have their fingers on the pulse of how these things may impact the industry going forward. Certainly, none of us can deny how we are absorbing more technology more quickly into our lives. Another trend that I think you have to kind of put on this list of things that are accelerating this. I have elderly parents. They use their iPad. They text with their doctors now. They want to make their appointments online. So it's not just the young people, but all of us are getting more comfortable using these technologies, and the confluence of these technologies coming together in unique ways, and new business models we're starting to see, some of which you'll hear from my colleagues on the panel, are all things that we need to pay attention to. And these curves, some of these curves are pretty amazing. Calm, if you're not familiar with them, they're into kind of the meditation space. Look at the acceleration on their user base. If you've seen their most recent commercials, who's their pitch person? LeBron James. 23andMe. You may have your own opinions, 23andMe, but no doubt the number of people who have their own DNA report is now reaching interesting levels. How many people are enrolled in all of us? 150,000 today, right? More data, even if it's less fidelity. Most consumers do not understand the difference between getting a full genome sequence and what they get from 23andMe, but the size of that data set makes it more interesting, and it's getting more and more utilized for research purposes. And so maybe most importantly, and I think the thing that should concern us the most in terms of how our industry is going to change, is the power of the consumer. Not just through the devices that they're wearing on their wrists, but the fact that more and more data around their experience is now being available. They want to bring it into the conversation, and this is a trend that's not going to slow. But couple this also with some of the things that we heard yesterday in terms of the priorities of this administration in terms of they are targeting, right? So the whole focus is on more and more transparency and more data in the hands of the healthcare consumer. And so you have all of this technologies making it easier, more and more data sources being available for you to go get in more of a consumer grade form rather than strictly through the healthcare system. More and more ability to visualize and interact with that data. And now you've got the federal government coming down saying, we're targeting waste. We're driving cost transparency. We're driving through policy the adoption of more interoperability of health data between organizations. We are opening up the data pipeline for it to flow much more freely. And how are we as organizations going to respond to that? Because we are just going to see healthcare consumers coming to us or interacting with us. And not just because they want their own My Portal, interaction point to make an appointment, but they're going to come to us as much more informed consumers saying, I want choices. I need a colonoscopy. I can have the traditional procedure, but why do I have to bring to my doctor the options of ColorGuard and other options that don't require me to be, spend half a day in a clinic? Right? I'm an informed consumer. People are going to be much more informed, and we have to be ready to deal in that world. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this, but the competitive landscape, and this is what I saw when I saw digital transformation hit consumer electronics and also in the lighting industry, is we're starting to see really different competitive landscapes. And it's not just the startup companies, but how many of you know that Best Buy is placing a huge bet on elderly living in place offering, basically built off of the Geek Squad that came out and helped you set up your wireless router in your home and your connectivity with your printer and all that. Stated this past December, their goal is to have 5 million patients using that service by 2025. A huge bet from a company that we would never consider to be playing in the healthcare space is now putting in probably their most strategic lever for growth, because they know they're not going to grow because of Amazon. The traditional storefront is not going to grow. So they're saying, we know there's a need for those that want to age in place, but have chronic diseases, that have care provider needs to their spouse or significant other. We're going to serve that market. 5 million patients. How many know that Comcast has a similar strategy, leveraging the 30 million desktops or tabletops that sit in there that deliver all of that cable service and streaming service, is also now they want to turn that into your chronic disease management platform that you're using in the home. There are very different competitors coming into our space, and these companies are going to they're going to bypass the providers, and they're going to try to go right to the payers and build relationships and revenue streams with the payers. These are very interesting trends for us to watch. And so I would make the assertion that this digitalization, digital transformation of healthcare, it's accelerating because of all of these things happening to us at the same time. So if you don't buy into all of them, if you buy only into some of them, it still means that these dominoes are falling faster, and we can't run at our current speed and be able to outrun the changes that are happening. Certainly, everything has to be an app today, right? So is there an app? Yep, there's an app for that, right? But I think we're going to see this. Certainly the federal priorities are to try to open up more interoperability data, get data flowing more freely, get more data at the hands of the consumer. But I don't think we're at the end of this. How many people in the audience are familiar with the open notes movement? Okay, maybe a little more than half. That's actually more than I thought we'd see today, right? But the open notes movement is basically making the clinician's notes available to the end consumer. You start this conversation in your organization, you will get a very heated debate about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But the evidence of the research that's been run so far is that patients like it. 2/3 of patients use it as a way of a reminder about what they were told by the doctor, not relying on just, this is what I recall, but actually being referred to it. But doctors have a tremendous amount of trepidation about making those notes available because they weren't written for the patient. They were written for the next clinician. They were written for reimbursement needs. But I think we're going to see that this concept of free flow of data is going to extend into things like open notes. I think you're going to see this push harder and become more an expectation of what the payer organizations want to see in terms of informed consumers. And I think you're going to see consumers pull to say, I want this information as part of how I'm managing my health trajectory. So the famous saying, software is eating the world, by Mark Andreessen. The question really is today, because software has eaten the world, what's it having for its next course? You're going to hear some things about artificial intelligence. I'm not going to go into them in detail because there are people far more experienced and knowledgeable in this space. But as a business leader trying to figure out how are we going to implement this through our structure and deal with the challenges of existing cultures, remember these 3 words, because artificial intelligence, depending on whose list you start, is anywhere between 18 and 27 different technologies, all at different levels of maturity. But it's really about how do we use technology to assist domain experts and decision makers, right? So what information can we augment into the situation that allows us to make a better decision? How do we augment? So it's not about replacing the radiologist. It's about using the algorithm for diagnosis or critical findings in addition to the radiologist who's doing his or her job. That takes that finds more, or let's say misses less critical findings. And then the third one, which is where we all kind of go to, is the autonomous part, which is how do we re-engineer people out of the equation altogether? And that is the nirvana for certain aspects of our society, and we'll have tremendous implications when we do that. But if you think about assist and augment as where we're going to start, there's still lots of opportunities to create not only better outcomes, but also do it at more effective levels and scale some of what we do at much, much greater rates than today. If the last 20 years have been about the human genome, the sequencing of the human genome, and how, again, Moore's law has come and we've reduced the cost of sequencing tremendously, and more people have sequenced. We have more and more sequences to deal with, and all of the data and what have we been able to learn about the nature of disease and the nature of treatment through all of that. Here's the one to watch for the next 20 years. The next 20 years will be the age of the microbiome. And we're finding now in the early research, in the microbiome is much more of a living system. It changes daily. The tests are pretty onerous today, but the entrepreneurs will find much more effective and cost-effective ways for us to get kind of data readouts on each of those. And we're finding all sorts of connectivity, connection between the microbiome and types of diseases. Many of the chronic diseases we're tying back. And so a lot of the breakthroughs I think we're going to see is the connection between the microbiome and our understanding of disease, and the importance and the connection of system biology and living, changing, evolving organisms. And so it brings something very interesting. So you talk about the microbiome, you start talking about what do we put into our bodies that change the microbiome. We talk about the gut microbiome specifically. And so really the differentiating, I think we see a lot of innovation in this space. And I do work with the food industry, and they are really coming this direction in a way because their world is being disrupted as people want more healthy options to put in their body. I think we're going to hear more of a dialogue between the differentiation between sick care and healthcare. And might we see enterprises that blend the two worlds together in terms of their offering to a healthcare consumer? Because I would describe that nobody wants to be labeled a patient. That's nobody's goal in life. right? And I believe that as a healthcare consumer, I would like an alternative to a pharmaceutical, put on a pharmaceutical, to say, can you personalize a diet for me through our understanding of food and how it impacts my microbiome? Can I have a personalized diet that has the same effect? And we've now seen research that shows that there are sub-phenotypes of type 2 diabetes patients, some of which are much better treated with personalized diets than putting on first-line pharmaceuticals. This is an area to watch, digital therapeutics. Key word, really, it's the implementation of digital technology along with more traditional techniques. And a lot of it is focused on the anti-aging. The baby boomers are aging. They'd like to hang around a little bit longer and consume a little bit more of that Social Security pot. So they are really interested in how they could shorten aging. Just very, very quick minutes. Yep. These companies, right? I talk about these just for a couple of minutes, just to show you that sometimes they're a little more than what we think. They do have the money to be able to invest, and they've targeted healthcare. A lot of people say, well, okay, so Amazon bought PillPack. They're just going to use their distribution channels to deliver pills to people's doorsteps. But how about this? They own the patent on facial recognition and heart rate analysis via cameras, so that your Alexa in the home now, the one that will come out with the camera on it, will also be able to basically take a baseline several times a day heart rate. Interesting, isn't it? Maybe not just about distribution and leveraging the supply chain. I think we all know what's going on with Google. It's not just about hiring smart people away from our organizations. It's about really bringing thought leaders with tremendous Rolodexes together to basically talk about impacting billions of people. So in closing, the digital transformation, it's a journey. If you look at companies that have done well in this journey, it's a several-year journey. And it's really about looking at a picture of something like this, right? That when you think about how is this going to impact our organization, it's a top-to-bottom discussion. It's not just talking about what data we're collecting and how we're going to use it, right? It's also talking about what's the ecosystem of partners. So look at what Mayo Clinic is doing. They're now leveraging their data. They've created basically a clinical platform division where all their data is living. They're generating new revenue streams for it. And they didn't look at Google as a competitor to what they're doing. They went out to Google and signed a $200 million agreement to leverage Google, their cloud storage, as well as their technologies to partner with them. Because as they talk, they realize that there is competition, but there's much more complement in what they're doing, and they're going to go transform the world together, right? So thinking in terms of ecosystems as well. We don't have to do this all ourselves, but who are the interesting partners? Are you inviting these little startups who are going to disrupt value chains in, or are you basically saying, we don't have time for you, we're busy doing what we're doing today? And so it really comes down to this. Technology is there, it works, or it wouldn't be in the marketplace. The data is exploding in terms of its size and use, but it ultimately comes down to how do we bring it into our organizations in a way that makes us more competitive, makes us more profitable, and helps us serve our markets more, more specifically. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.